All right, we're ready to start. I am going to introduce our speaker, our author tonight. Beth Kastner is from the law firm of Epstein, Becker and Green, which is a national healthcare firm. I'll have Beth introduce herself right now.
Thanks, Ira. I am Beth Kastner. I am an attorney at Epstein, Becker and Green, partner with the firm. I've been practicing, this is my 20th year, and since day one, I've exclusively represented healthcare providers and systems. So my client base is health systems, large physician groups, and some ancillary providers like hospices. I do a lot of work in obviously the fraud abuse space that we're going to speak about tonight. And in that space, I do a fair amount of work with developing physician comp models, whether it's for a physician group or for a hospital-owned physician group. Excuse me. And when you're doing physician comp models, obviously an important component of that is making sure they're structured in a manner that complies with the fraud abuse laws. And when I say the fraud abuse laws, largely there's two laws we're talking about. And Ira asked me to speak on both high level, which I will do when we get rolling here. The Stark Law, the Physician Self-Referral Prohibition Statute, or more commonly known as the Stark Law, and the federal Anti-Kickback Statute law. Those are the two fraud abuse laws. So that's my introduction. And I do want this to be very interactive. If people have questions, please feel free to interrupt me, and I will be happy to address them live. So.
All right, so if people have questions, they could either talk, which is fine with me, or they could message me on the chat, and I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask your question. I am just going to first show my screen. I think everyone could see this. This is probably the best picture of Pete Stark that I could find. You know, for those of us, this law came out in 1989, the Stark Law. And I graduated from my residency program in 1990 at the age of 4. And Pete Stark was El Diablo to us. I mean, the way he sort of demonized doctors, we felt at the time. We were so amazed that there was any of this going on. You know, you can self-refer, and it seemed so many doctors at the time owned physical therapy practices and stuff. So I'll ask you a first question, Beth. What was the initial impact in sort of broad strokes of the Stark regulation at the time? What was its broadest impact?
Yeah, I mean, so the Stark Law, as you alluded to, is very much geared towards regulating and prohibiting certain financial relationships. When Stark is triggered, high level, when a physician makes referrals to certain entities for what's called designated health services, if that terminology is familiar to folks on the phone. So it's not all things that a physician would refer that trigger the prohibition, but as you alluded to, things that constitute DHS include hospital services, and in the physician practice setting, in particular your specialty, imaging is a type of designated health services. So X-ray, MRI referrals. So what the Stark Law says is, hey, physician, if you're going to refer to one of these entities for these types of services, these DHS, you can only do so, if you're going to refer and you have a compensation relationship, a financial relationship, which typically are going to be employment or ownership. So it's not just the referral that triggers Stark, it's the referral and having a financial relationship with the entity that receives the referral. Then if that happens, you have to meet an exception. And there's no intent driven. So as I mentioned before the call started, kickback is different in that the government has to prove that you had improper intent to induce or reward referrals of Medicare and Medicaid services. Stark isn't like that, which is why it is very concerning from a structuring standpoint. There is no intent. If you don't mean an exception, if it's implicated, you don't mean exception, it's a violation, whether you meant to violate it or not. And so when we talk about the exceptions, there's a variety of exceptions, things like employment. So the one that we're going to talk about today is under the Stark, there's a construct called group practices. So not all physician practices are de facto group practices. You have to meet certain requirements to be a group practice. So Stark says you have to have certain structuring requirements. You have to have certain, ownership or employee requirements. They dictate how it has to be structured. And without getting into the nuances of all those details, because there's several of them, the basic premise or why they say you have to comply with these requirements is because they don't just want a loose association of physicians. They want it to actually be a group that comes together. And if you do that, then you can compensate physicians in that group practice in a manner that's different than if they were strictly your employee. This is a very technical area, so I'll try as best I can to kind of make it more practical and understandable for obviously folks in your situation. So high level, though, to get back to your question, what Stark and to some extent Kickback is really getting at is the government doesn't want it. It structured these laws to prevent what it viewed as mechanisms that incentivize maybe over referring, overutilization, because of course that ends up in the government paying more for more claims. If they think every time I refer a patient for this type of imaging, I'm going to get payment for that referral, that's going to lead to more referrals, and they don't want to have, that's not good for patient care. That's the government's rationale in part for why laws like Stark were enacted.
So I'm going to jump a little bit to a previous journal club where we had on private equity buying practices. So, for example, would a group practice be one of these, let's say Spire, a convener, an MSO but they all come under the heading of a big private equity group. Would that qualify as a group under Stark?
Well, so I mean, you'd have to look at merely having private equity investors does not negate your otherwise established group practice structure, right? So that's not uncommon to see private equity involved in a group practice that remains Stark compliant. So the rationale again behind that is to have it gets less into private equity or not. It gets more into do the physicians in the group provide all their services to the group? Are they working for 50 different companies? Are they full-time employees? They want to see what the relationship is with these physicians. And again, that's all embedded within the Stark definition of group practice, which once you get past that, honestly, that's of the elements of Stark, that's relatively easy. It's kind of a checklist of do we meet the requirements of being a group practice. Where it gets more complicated, and again, where the article focuses on is how do you allocate compensation? How do you allocate profits? So assuming for purposes of our discussion, and whether or not your group practice, that's been a concept that's been around, for years with Stark. Assuming you're a group practice, then that's where the rules come into play in terms of compensation, which give you a little bit more flexibility in terms of how you compensate physicians for profits from ancillary revenue that the group may generate, like your imaging profits, high level.
All right, so let me give you an example. A lot of people on this call are in a hospital-based practice, and let's just make believe we all split away and we form a group, okay? Mm-hmm. And we contract out to 3 or 4 hospitals, but we own our own MRI center, okay? Where we all, from if we're working at multiple hospitals as a contract, are we allowed to refer to our own MRI center? as long as anybody else doesn't refer to it? I mean, is that, how does that work?
Well, so the concept of, again, if you're a group practice, then you're looking at, I think the concept that you're picking up on is probably the in-office ancillary exception,
Yes.
which you may have heard of, which is kind of another construct of how we kind of circle the wagon of group practice, which allows you to refer. Now that would address, and again, there's a whole other set of laws about what's in a permissible location in which you can refer to, but effectively it's generally speaking locations in which, are locations of the group practice. So, you have an imaging suite or location where you see patients for E&M services. That would, you can look at the in-office ancillary services exceptions to make those referrals. Now, the hospital piece would be separate and apart from that, right? Because you could only use group practice for referrals to ancillary referrals within the group. Because again, that's what they're saying we will protect, right? Because we think that's good for patient care. That, if you have a group practice, you want to, maintain that continuity of care, you can refer them for in-office ancillary. So there is a whole path that you go down if, again, to answer your question, I believe, if we're a group practice, we're several physicians who come together and we want to have, ancillary services like imaging, you can do that under the Stark law in your group practice.
All right. So Andrew, you have a question you want to ask yourself, Dr. Wickline?
Yeah. So one of the unintended consequences of Stark regulation is that, you must offer, physical therapy services to everyone in town so that there's no kickback, right? The problem with that is that you can no longer control the reproducibility of what you're getting by offering it to everyone in town. And so I think a number of physicians brought this to CMS's, I think CMS, or I'm not sure which regulatory body, but they brought that to people's attention because, in BPCIA, when I want to control costs, I need to know who I'm sending. If someone needs therapy, I need to know I'm going to send it to someone who's not going to drag it out and have 400 sessions of therapy and so forth. And separately, I'd love to have a in-house nurse practitioner do all my clearances. But again, I worry about the stark ramifications of that. But yet at the same time, that's giving best in class care. I've got one of the lowest costs in the nation. How do I get it across the government that this, how do I do it safely?
Well, and so I think, and I want to go back and understand that I understand kind of your setup. So when you're saying the, pressure expectation to, kind of spread the referrals around, so to speak, for PT, is that what you were indicating?
Yeah, so at one point, one of the therapists wrote a paper with me, the lowest opioids for total hips. She wanted to be part of my practice, but I can't refer to her if she's part of my practice. So she has to have an office down the hall. And then I have to give patients a whole list of therapists. But, I do mention that this is someone that works closely with me, right? So it's really challenging when really we already offer the lowest costs by doing it this way. And I don't know how to do it in a safe function. I think that one of the unintended consequences is that you're not getting reproducibility by allowing this lack of keeping it in a closed network. So how do surgeons get that?
Yeah, I guess what's confusing me on your fact pattern is if you can refer to whomever you want. These laws don't kick in unless you or your group have a financial relationship with the entity receiving the referral. So I think what I hear perhaps you saying is the scenario you're getting is we need to be referring perhaps not to necessarily who we think is the best provider of the care for our patient, but rather to be equitable in our referral patterns to avoid any appearance of shifting referrals or giving too many referrals to a particular provider. Is that right?
Well, yeah, I guess,
you said she's in your practice. If she's in your practice, you could refer to her with no problem under the Stark law. If she's in your group practice, you can make referrals to other partners or practitioners. But I think you were indicating that person might be kind of outside your practice.
She would be an employee in my practice,
working down the hall.
So the New York State attorneys under Stark said that if an employee in the practice, she would be an employee, she wanted an employee position doesn't want to, have the headache of billing, it wants to be an employed position. And so it wouldn't be a partner. That's the problem, right? She would be an employee, so self-referring and then trying to get. I don't mean to hijack the conversation. I really want to.
No, and maybe the disconnect might be if it's a state law. I'll be honest with you. If it's a New York Stark law, I wouldn't be familiar with it.
Okay.
But again, I think in my experience, and maybe this is helpful or not, generally speaking, if there's no bad intent, there's ways to structure arrangements without triggering these laws. And again, maybe it's a state-specific requirement that you've been struggling with, because it sounds like you had a state regulator that was giving that guidance.
I apologize.
Let me ask another question here. For orthopedic practices that have operated as a Stark Law group practice, there's been a change in January.
Yes.
Everyone's been talking about a change. We're having enough trouble figuring out what the original is, but what has been the main or key practical impacts of the Stark rule change from January 1st, 2022?
Yeah, so let me do my best shot at that. The practical change, the most significant change that I'm finding clients are struggling with is the change, or what CMS would call clarification. They said this was always our intent, people just didn't understand it. But change, clarification, whatever you want to call it, is the prohibition on split pooling. What that means is the government says, hey, you can share profits, DHS profits, among the group practices. But if you're going to do that, you've got to put all the DHS in one bucket. So what you can't do, let me give you an example. Let's say you have a physician practice, an orthopedic practice, who is group practice, and they have a compensation system where physicians are able to share in the profits of, let's say they do lab. So they have lab, and they have PT, and they have x-ray. And so what they did in the past is they would say, we're gonna have a pool just for the x-ray, and we're gonna have a separate pool for the lab, or we may just give you the x-ray. We may just share in the profit of the x-ray. What the government has clarified is if you're gonna share the profits of the DHS at all, you can't do it service by service. You can't say, I'm just gonna give you the lab, or I'm just gonna give you the x-ray. You have to first pool all the profits, and then you can split them up as you see fit under the same prior rules, which is equally per capita based on seniority. Those are all okay. You still have to look at the concept of 5 or more. So the pods are 5 or more physicians, as the Stark says. So again, it's the service by service piece that you can no longer do. So let me give you an example outside your world, if this at all resonates, is I had an OB practice to an OB pod, and they would give their physicians, they do a variety of DHS, okay? So they do lab, ultrasound, but they were only giving physicians the share of the ultrasound. And under the new rule, they can't do that. They can still give them the ultrasound, but they have to give them, they first have to put in the bucket. They got to pour all the DHS profits in this. They got to do the lab, they have to do the ultrasound, then they can divide it. The government thinks that's a safer method, and it makes it less likely that a compensation model is going to incentivize physicians inappropriately, because if you do just a service by service allocation, the government would argue that's too tied to the order that the physician would make. And so that's the clarification that I'll pause, because you're probably like, what are you even talking about? But that's the clarification that I've had to make a fair amount of revisions to comp plans to make it so that all the DHS goes in the pool, or some comp plans have just been restructured where they said, okay, well, we can't do the ultrasound only pool. We'll just revisit how we do the comp overall. So split pooling / service by service distributions are no longer permitted. It's highly technical, so I apologize if that made not a lot of sense.
No, it's okay. I get it.
Actually, one of the most complicated parts of Stark, but that's kind of in a nutshell the most significant change, if that makes sense.
So if I probably know the answer to this, but
Yeah.
in the stock regulation, if you had different pools in the past, was it because certain partners made money in one pool or certain partners made money in other pools? Or if there were three pools, who made the money in those pools?
Well, I mean, it was really all depends on where the finances made sense. So, you know, a lot of pods will be the typical easy example to understand is location, right? So you got 5 office locations. So each office location is a pod. Sometimes people got more complex and they would not base it based on location. They'd say, hey, physician, if you produce x-ray revenue, if you refer and produce for the practice x-ray and lab, well, we have a lab pod that has physicians from all different locations. We have a imaging pod from all the different locations. Now you can't do that anymore. You can't have pods based on type of DHS.
Got it.
Again, you start with at least 5 docs, and then you pour it all in the bucket, every DHS you do, and then you can look at your distribution methodology. Now, whether you view that to be logical or not is a $1 million question, but it necessitated a fair amount of change to comp plans.
And this is just a sort of a remedial question. What defines a group with Stark? What is a group?
Well, for purposes of, well, like I said, so there's a concept of a group practice, which is the big picture. Like, do you have centralized billing? Do you have at least 2 employees? That's that checklist test that I told you that, you know, is where you start. But assuming you're a group practice, now when we're talking about profit distribution, CMS will say if you are a group of, if you're a organization of 5 or more physicians, each pod has to be at least 5. Because again, that's their view at. If it's at least 5, that's going to be, you know, it's going to spread out any concern of if there's only 2 physicians, then it's going to be 2 tied to referral. So when you're looking at doing comp plans, you have to look at 5. And again, it could be based on location. It could be based, you could have a pod of 60 docs as long as it's 5. Now, if your practice only has 3 physicians to begin with, then the government says that's fine. But once you get to 5, that's where you start looking at the size.
What happens to docs who are involved in multiple arrangements? For example, let's just take a hand surgeon who is in great demand in an area. Hand surgeons in general are in great demand, and they work 2 days for one group and 3 days for another group. Totally different groups, totally different employee identification numbers.
Well, I mean, that what I would say is, as counsel for each of those groups, I would need to look at that physician's, you know, I'm less concerned if I represent the individual physician per se, because you know, I could look at how they're compensated, but that group might need to look at that physician's limited involvement and see if it impacts their overall ability to meet the group practice definition. Again, there's like 75% tests. And so one physician may not throw it off to the whole group if he's kind of in and out. But again, that really gets to the group analyzing. But there's nothing to say a physician can't be, for example, an independent contractor of several groups. Maybe they just get paid based on production. Totally fine. There's no issue with that.
For the DHS. So can this hand surgeon who works 40% for Eastern orthopedics and 60% for Western orthopedics, can they share in the DHS? Can that hand surgeon share in the DHS?
Yeah, and that gets into whether they meet the definition of being a member of the group, which is a separate analysis. But if I recall, and don't quote me on this, I think if they're an independent contractor during the times they're on the premises, they might be able to be included as a member of a group. I'd have to double check that, but it's possible.
Wow, so it is possible. So what can practices still do under Stark, and what has completely not changed?
So what has completely not changed is the way that they've been able to allocate revenue in a group practice for years. And that is so long as the distribution is not directly related to referrals. The difference being it can be indirectly. Now, if you're under the employment exception, you can't even do indirectly. So that's an example of where group practice is broader. So CMS in the regulations spells out ways that they say, hey, these are okay. We're going to deem these to be indirect, like per capita, per person. So all those rules have not changed. So your counsel who structured comp plans 5 years ago, none of that's going to be impacted. What I really had to look at for my clients is that split pool issue, like I said.
Define split pool. Define split pool. Yeah.
So split pool would be if you allocated profits for only one type of DHS. So again, in my example, my OB ultrasound, or just the X-ray. That you can't do. That's called split pooling. It's a term of art. I don't know why, but that you can no longer do. You got to put it all in the bucket. So what I look at these comp plans, and what counsel would do if they're looking at your comp plans to ensure they're compliant with Stark law after this change, is they would just look at all the buckets of comp. They would look at the plan and see, and it probably goes without saying, the other thing that hasn't changed is personal productivity. If you personally performed a service, E&M, totally fine. Whether that's employment or group practice, that's a no concerns there. The only time this really becomes a concern is when you're getting a cut of revenue from technical, for example, right, that you just ordered. Because that's what they're really concerned about, is when you're getting compensation on the back end for services you just ordered. Again, you can do it so long as it meets one of the indirect ways that the government looks at it. So really, the takeaway is really just all that's changed is that very kind of super technical, you can't have allocations just based on one type of DHS if the physician produces, referrals for other types of DHS. So if you're referring for lab that goes into profits, and you are also referring for imaging, and you have a comp plan where you only get a cut of imaging, that would be something you'd probably want to look at to make sure it remains compliant.
All right. So Marty,
but there's so many layers of this. The other thing I would say, some comp plans, the council may draft it so that you could still do the split pool if you excluded Medicare DHS. So you could still do split pools for commercial imaging only. So there's a lot of layers. See what I mean? Because this really only deals with fee-for-service Medicare. I probably should have mentioned that up front.
No problem.
So there, you want to be creative but compliant with your comp plans for clients, and so I hesitate to do a one-size-fits-all. But again, it's the service-by-service distribution that requires a close look.
So when we have
that's a key takeaway.
All right. So we have a question from Marty Nichols. Marty, you want me to read it, or you got this?
I don't mind grabbing it. In your article you wrote, I was reading a deal where value-based medicine is now one of the carve-outs for these doctors. So if you've got a group of 10 doctors and 2 of them participate in value-based medicine, you can compensate them differently. But then what happens to all the other DHS? Can they still share in the MRI and in the PT and stuff equally with the other 8?
Well, so what that's saying is it's separate and apart. Basically, that's saying if that physician participates in a value-based enterprise, which is, the value-based enterprise has to meet different Stark rules, then profits that flow through that can go direct to those 2 physicians out of the 10. So it really just says it's kind of a loosening of any concerns. They want to encourage people to set up these value-based entities, which in my experience, people are just still putting their toe in the water about how to do those. So if you're a VBE and you have 2 docs that participate, the revenue that flows from those 2 from contracts under the VBE can flow through. So that's all.
So they have to pull their imaging.
Impact.
does their imaging and stuff then get pulled out of the other numbers and just count towards theirs, or do they still get a share?
No,
on the
I mean,
other stuff?
they really should be separate, because again, the value-based stuff is more like you're going to look at maybe like shared savings for cost savings. It's not going to be, I don't envision you're getting ancillary revenue, like imaging revenue from value-based and imaging revenue and regular practice. It's going to be a different bucket of compensation. I think they were just kind of throwing that in there to say, when you're looking at your comp plans, if you have only certain physicians that get that revenue from the value-based, you can kind of treat that separate and not worry about it screwing up your comp plan.
So there is a separate value-based entity. I guess that's what I was getting at earlier.
So
something was coming.
Yeah.
We were told that, you know, if you do something, you can have a therapist, you can streamline things, you can keep it in-house, so to speak. So that's what I need to have someone talk to me about a value-based entity, perhaps. I guess that's what I was getting at earlier.
Yeah, so value-based enterprises are high level. What the government's saying there is you can be protected when you have compensation arrangements with referring physicians, and the degree of regulation or complexity varies based on the VBE's assumption of risk. So high level, if you have a value-based entity that takes on full capitated risk, the government thinks that's a good thing. And, you know, full capitation, for example, is a payment structure that there's not a lot of room for stinkiness. So if you want to be a VBE that is full risk, it's fairly easy to, if you're willing to go down that path, there's not a lot of rules around it, and you do have some flexibility with compensation within the VBE. But there's different layers. There's substantial financial risk, there's full financial risk. But that's, you can't just, a VBE is not just, we're trying to improve care. It's a legal construct that you set up and you operate, if that makes sense. But that's something that did come out, I think, to your point, that's a whole new area of law that came out from the Stark Law. I mean, you could do 4-hour webinars on that, but that's an area that physicians, hospitals are starting to dip their toes in to see if they want to set up a VBE. Is it worth the hassle to set it up to the benefit in terms of how they want to be able to incentivize providers for certain things?
So I have a question on that was mentioned by Andrew a little bit, but it is of great importance to a lot of orthopedic surgeons, and we're never really sure whether what I'm about to ask you is Stark regulations or kickback, because they seem to be. So if one of the surgeons in the department or one of the surgeons anywhere develops a device, a cooling, let's say a special cooling device for the leg, are they allowed to encourage the patient to purchase the item even though they have ownership in it, or encourage the use of? I know that when you develop something for another company, you don't get profits from that, you know, but in a sense, if you're a part owner in a company, the company does well anyway. So does Stark address those issues? Because we have a number of our physicians who do consult to companies on products and implants, and it gets confusing, and no one wants to get caught.
Well, I like the way you concluded, because that's the right way of thinking. You're right. Now we're outside of Stark now, because, you know, when these are all generalizations, right? But typically when you're dealing with medical device manufacturers or companies, they're not going to be DHS entities under Stark, right? That's entities that submit bills for Medicare, Medicaid. So you're not going to see typically Stark being implicated, but you got kickback. And you're right, you have to be careful in your messaging, because you don't want the government to say your ownership interest is, you know, influencing the money you get from the company is influencing your recommendations to patients, right? Not to say it couldn't be done, but you need to be mindful of that. I will say, when you're looking at a hospital setting, there's other factors that come into play, right? You've got conflict of interest disclosure requirements, that the hospital is probably going to know about that. But, again, it's one of those things where it's kind of two separate things, right? On the one hand, you're making a recommendation to a patient. Separate and apart, you might have an ownership interest in the product being recommended. The two don't necessarily tie, but what I, as a healthcare attorney, say to my clients is that's not to say the government couldn't make that argument. And for me to advise on particular situations, what we do is we look at advisory opinions the government's put out. It's kind of like the equivalent of you guys running labs, right? We look at court cases. We look at that particular fact pattern and see, do we have evidence that the government has made that case before? I think it would be questionable. Like, let me give you an example of something that might raise an eyebrow, which I don't have to tell you this. If historically you use one product and that's who you always recommended for the patient, and all of a sudden it flipped to this different product, and again, what kind of comes to mind is my conflict of interest concerns, honestly, which is another area of law,
right?
Which is the hospital's concern from a tax exempt entity. They've got to watch their conflict of interest. So, you're covering it all.
I know,
you're covering all the health. It's like, what are all the possible diseases I could get? We're trying to. Laws. I love it.
We're trying to make sure that this legal patient has every illness in the world.
Right. Yes.
On this conference. If a group, some more practical things, if physicians were considering how to pay people on DHS, what is the safest way under STAR?
Oh, yeah.
The absolute.
Yeah, so if you want to not worry about any of the group practice stuff, safest way, just pay everyone based on personal productivity, period. Because even if it's DHS, you can pay on personal productivity.
Oh, you can?
Oh, yeah. If you personally performed a service.
Right.
And like a work RVU model, for example, based on personal productivity. That's a straightforward, a flat salary. That's going to just fall in. If someone's a W-2 employee, their physician, you just want to pay them a flat salary. You don't need to be a group practice for that.
Right.
The way I would frame it is, if you were in management of a physician practice, a position of leadership, and your practice wants to look at ways of paying profits,
right?
Then that's when you need to, I would suggest, consult competent counsel to look at your comp plan and help walk through the ways you can do it. That's where hopefully your counsel can be your partner, because I've seen, me or whomever else it would be, various ways of structuring comp plans. But it's also driven a lot by, I often work in consultation with the finance guy, right? They kind of say, they look at the doc's productivity, and so you look at ways you can do that. Sometimes it's reactive. They tell me how they want to do it, and then I say, great, no, let's look at it. Or perhaps it's a blank slate, and then you just go to whoever is your advisor and you tell them what your goals are as an organization.
So practices,
but personal productivity is usually pretty low risk.
Practices are funny beasts. Every once in a while, you get some practices that have maybe 5 owners and maybe 15 employees. Okay, now does that throw a wrench into some of these compensation arrangements?
No.
Okay, so, but the owners could define the compensation relationship, right?
Right.
Now I say that only
and
because
you don't have to be like go ahead. You have, let me give you an example. Maybe there's another way of addressing it. Like, I do a lot of work for hospital-owned physician practices. There's no owners in any of they're W-2 employees, and they get paid, based on the profits of the ancillary. So you can have profit sharing even for a W-2 employee, or not. I mean, you don't have to as well. The government made that very clear. You can compensate some positions to include the profit sharing, and some you don't have to.
So in theory, a hospital-based practice can have an arrangement with the hospital based on certain DHS?
Now, when you say hospital-based, are you saying they're
A W-2
employed by the
employee,
hospital?
W-2 employee. Let's assume
Yeah.
there's 17 orthopedic surgeons working for the hospital as W-2
Right.
employees. Can they go up to the
I see where you're
hospital
going.
and
Yeah.
say, hey, we refer 25,000 physical therapy appointments. And physical therapy is making a lot of money. We're referring 15,000 MRIs. We want a piece of that action.
Well, the hospital will say, of course, we can't make compensation decisions based on the referrals you send to our system.
Because that would be
after that.
That would be a stock
That's
regulation.
just not what. Or kickback. I mean, it's just, again, from a compliance standpoint, that's not what they're going to hear. But what the answer in terms of structure is, yes, the hospital could explore that sharing of profits, but what the hospital would have to, they can't just, if you're a W-2 of XYZ Community Hospital, they can't be a group practice. They're going to have to set up, which is not uncommon. They set up a separate legal entity that ticks through that group practice structure that I mentioned. So in theory, is why you often see XYZ Hospital Physicians Inc. or whatever,
So in theory, this 17-person W-2 could turn into a 17-person 1099, like consultant to the hospital.
Well, what they probably do is they would become W-2 of the new
corporation,
the new entity, right? And then the corporation has an arrangement with the hospital to provide services. So the physician group contracts with hospital to basically staff its affiliated hospital. That's how that would typically flow. Right.
Tell me a little bit about the issue we talked about earlier about exceptions for ASCs. It's so, for example, whether it's a hospital-based practice, a W-2 employee or a group practice, and they want to build an ASC. Are rules different concerning ASCs? Because the ASCs are not classically DHS.
Right, totally different analysis. Now you're doing a kickback analysis, and you're going to look at the safe harbor for investors in ASC, right? So again, the financial relationship when you're an investor, if you're just on staff and you perform procedures there, no issue. You just do your own billing. There's no issue at the ASC because you don't have a financial relationship with them. The issue becomes if you're an investor in the ASC, now you're getting money from them. So there's a financial relationship from a kickback perspective. So there's safe harbors, which if you don't meet them, it doesn't mean you violated Stark. It's just a protection. It's a safe harbor. And those they're called 1/3 tests. And those get into things like, do you typically have a practice in an ASC? Is this really an extension of your medical practice where you may not meet the safe harbors if you're a passive investor? So an example might be a PCP investing in a orthopedic practice or an orthopedic ASC. Because the government would say, well, all you're going to do is be a source of referrals. You're not going to actually use it. If we're going to allow you to get that safe harbor protection, we want you to actually be a physician who's going to practice at that ASC, not just be a passive source of referrals. So that's a whole nother analysis where your lawyer would say, let me tick through, let me look at the pool of investors and see if we can meet that safe harbor. Oftentimes you can't fully meet it, but you structure it in substantial compliance. So that's the analysis that's done, but it's a kickback analysis when you're looking at ASC investments.
Marty, you had another question? Marty Nichols?
Yeah, I'm listening to you talk about being able to incentivize doctors for productivity. But then how do you in the DHS world differentiate between productivity and referrals? I mean, isn't productivity the more images a doctor sends to the imaging center, they're more productive?
No. When I say productivity, I mean their personal productivity. generating revenue from a patient encounter, surgical or office-based.
Not
So
their productivity in
the
the
healthcare.
DHS.
No, not productivity and how much do you refer or how much do you generate in terms of overall revenue from work that others have performed. Personal productivity means old school, seeing patients. That's why I said it's low risk, but it's also obviously that means, seeing patients, and that's, labor intensive.
I always remember, and this might have been just medical urban legend, that to safely be in a group practice, you had to have 75% of your time in that group practice. And I'm talking about that hand surgeon situation. If they were 75% of their time in practice 1 and 25% in practice 2, they had a safe harbor. They were safe from kickback.
Yeah, you're going back. You're right. Yeah, you're going back to what's the checklist for us to even be a group practice, and and I have it pulled up here on my side screen, which is what I'm looking over here. That's the perform 75% of your services through the group test.
Okay.
And so, we'll do for clients whole analysis. They'll give us their whole listing of physicians, and they'll say they work, 25% for us or whatever. And then you look at it collectively and see if that raises concerns that it's going to screw up their group practice definition. So that's the one test. Like, I'll give you an example, and again, I apologize, I have to read it. A group with only 3 members performing 100% of their services to the group and 4 members each performing 25% of their services to the group would not qualify. However, if a group has 3 members spending 100% of their time working for the group and 2 members who each spend half their time working for the group would still qualify. So you have to look at the aggregate percentages, right. But your basic recollection and rule of thumb is correct. There's the 75% test. That's one of the elements that I was high level mentioning and not getting into the weeds on.
Yeah, let's talk about intent for a second, because you touched on that earlier. Stark does not have to show intent. You break it, you go to jail, you don't pass go, you don't collect, your $200. And kickback, they have to show intent. I mean, is that
right?
So
that's right. And so kickback, so let me give you an example of kickback intent. Is if the government would come in and pull the hospital records and they see a bunch of PowerPoints where hospital executives met with physicians and physicians were saying, we refer all this business to you. Yeah. And then a month later, they employed the physicians and they paid them way, way high compensation. The government might cite to that PowerPoint as evidence of improper intent, that really they employed you in part, because it could even be, if it's only one of the reasons, even if they actually needed your specialty, if one of several reasons is to induce or reward referrals of, this one's broader, this is Medicare, Medicaid. Mm-hmm. They could use that as improper intent to violate kickback. So Stark is much more technical. They just have to show how you didn't meet an exception, right? Where kickback, they have to make the case. And again, that's where we have advisory opinions, we have cases, we have precedent to guide clients on their particular fact pattern. And then it's also preventative, right? Which is we do training, we do training on appropriate, materials, what's appropriate to put in pitch materials. And so I'm rambling at this point.
No.
What was your original question?
I know it was the idea of it's a tough
intent.
topic.
Yes, you have
the idea of intent. So you also brought up another point, which I'll bring up, which is physician compensation as a way of kickback or not. There was if a hospital wants to bring in a surgeon, let's just say a neurosurgeon, a spine surgeon, okay?
Right.
And they know this spine surgeon, the Part A collection to the hospital is really high, okay? And they want to pay this surgeon $2 million a year, okay?
Right.
Because that's what the surgeon negotiated, said, I'm not coming here.
Right.
But what if the government says, but wait, that's not the fair market value of other surgeons in the community? So is that
before I let my client hire a neurosurgeon, I would make sure they had a third party comp opinion, right? So that's where all the comp consultants that I'm sure schmooze with you at events, they are very appropriately helpful, right? So they are an independent third party who will provide support. And sometimes they'll say that I can't support that comp, but hopefully they would be able to, based on the particular circumstances, justify the comp. And so my client would have that protection. They don't turn for me. I don't opine on whether a particular compensation amount is fair market value. That's not what I do. My clients would use the comp consultant for that. I would look at other factors, because there's also, it's not just fair market value, it's also this concept of commercial reasonableness that's a stark concept, but does the whole deal make sense, right? You want to look at the whole deal and look for factors that may be something a government would pick up on. And that's where your counsel can say, gosh, that element of this transaction, particularly if you're acquiring a practice, you just want to understand all the facts and circumstances. But high comp in and of itself is not illegal. It's just you need to have, or I recommend having protections if you're gonna. And I'm sure you're all familiar with like MGMA. That's very common. If you're going to be paying, kind of a rule of thumb is 90th percentile or above. That's when you would want to perhaps consider getting that opinion.
So
can I ask a follow-up question on that? So I live in Utica, New York. No one wants to come to Utica, New York. It's not, we had snow on Tuesday. It's not sexy. So I can't hire someone even at a 90th percentile. The only way I can encourage someone to come here is with a really great salary. And so this is the problem with this fair market value. I can't get someone to come up here. It's fair market value in New York City to make, $2 million or $10 million doing the volume that I do, but I can't get that here. I just, even though I'm doing the same volume. So how do we get around that so I can hire someone, or the hospital can hire someone and get around this arcane MGA numbers?
And that was a bad example. MGMA is just one benchmark. If you get a comp consultant, they're going to look at all those factors, and community need, an area that's hard to recruit, a specialty that's hard to recruit. Those are all factors that an outside comp consultant would factor in to give you that support. So they're not going to just look, because they will approve, these comp consultants will approve something that's over 90th percentile sometimes, given the facts and circumstances. So in that case, I would say what you just described would be a very strong supporting factor to go above that, benchmark.
Beth, we didn't talk about
But like I said, that's just something the government might look at. They're going to look at, something that's really high. It's going to be an outlier, but that's where you'd be able to come back and say, the non-referral based reasons you just articulated, and ideally you'd have that instant support.
So I have a question. We don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to, first of all, thank you before anyone gets off. But I didn't ask you this before, so I'm kind of putting you on the spot just a tiny bit. What are some of the bonehead, stark mess ups that you could remember in the last few years that people did, and like, oh my God, what were you guys thinking? That this is just a classic stark regulation.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I love the question. I think I will answer it this way. I wouldn't have that reaction to stark violations because they tend to be more technical. I don't typically see a stark violation. If you have a bonehead situation, it's likely going to be stark and kickback, right? Because See what I mean? Stark's more technical. Like if you screw up your comp plan structure, you're like your 75% test or whatever for Stark, I'm not going to call you a bonus. It's very technical. Kickback, I will tell you, it's things, bonehead things I will see is oftentimes what I call like ink in the milk. One of my mentors used to always call it the ink in the milk, which is the emails that talk about, things that just are low-hanging fruit for the government to prove their case of improper intent. It's really be careful what you put in writing. That's kind of
right.
as simplistic as I can think.
Yeah, we always used to say that the E in email equals evidence, evidence mail. It was good. So do we have any other final questions? We're at 9 o'clock. I never like to keep people. I think Beth Kastner from Epstein Becker Green is quite an expert in all the.
And you can, if you have any questions, always feel free to follow up. I'm always happy to answer questions. And
I'm going to send out Beth's email to everybody to follow up. It's 9 o'clock now. Unless anyone has any pressing questions, I'd like us to adjourn. This will be a recording that will show on Doc Social and then on YouTube. And I just really want to thank everyone for joining, and I hope it was valuable for everyone.